Good morning. It's Reverend Mike Capron from the First Presbyterian Church of Troy, Pennsylvania. We're continuing our two-part series. This is part 2 on the book of Ruth, covering chapters 2 through 4. I'll be reading text as part of the sermon, so let's dive right in. Last week in Ruth chapter 1, we were introduced to Naomi, a Jewish woman from Bethlehem some 1,300 years before Jesus. There was a famine in Israel, so she, her husband, and their 2 sons fled east to pagan territory in Moab. Things went well. Her sons grew up and married 2 local girls, Ruth and Orpah. Then it all turned sour. First Naomi's husband, then her older son, and then the younger son all died. Naomi and one of the young women who married her son returned to Bethlehem. The younger Moabite woman is Ruth, for whom the book is named. Naomi comes home to what was familiar and is flooded with memories and grief. She declares herself to be bitter as she shares her pain with her home community. That's where we left off last week. The pressing problem we turn to today is that both Naomi and Ruth are basically destitute. They have no money, and as women of that era, they cannot inherit or own family property, which passes exclusively through the male line. Well, first things first, they need food to eat. Ruth is young and strong, so she goes gleaning at harvest time. Gleaning is when you go and gather part of the crop that was missed by the reapers or harvesters, when you collect what they missed. Why are there leftovers, you might ask? Wouldn't more attention and better technique mean that there weren't any crops left over? For asking that question, you are exposed as a profit-maximizing, wicked 21st century capitalist. Forgive my hyperbole. I know there's a huge cultural gap between the ancient Near East and the United States today, but gleaning was a common practice then, and it is not now. Still, we should be challenged by God's law. Leaving crops for the poor to glean is explicitly mandated by at least 4 biblical passages in the law of Moses, 2 in Leviticus and 2 in Deuteronomy. It was the religious duty to leave a field for gleaning. Deuteronomy 24:19-22 is typical. I read, "When you are harvesting in your field and you overlook a sheaf, do not go back to get it. Leave it for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow, so that the Lord may bless you in all the work of your hands. When you beat the olives from your trees, do not go over the branches a second time. Leave what remains for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow. When you harvest the grapes in your vineyard, do not go over the vines again. Leave what remains for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt. That is why I command you to do this." That last part's important. God's people were once mistreated, penniless slaves in Egypt. In the book of Exodus, God rescued them from slavery and brought them into a good land where they could reap a good harvest. So don't look down on poor people, especially the foreigner, the orphan, and the widow. You used to be like them. You used to be refugees like them. Let them get something to eat. Or in the 21st century, be kind to those with less than you and take something to the food pantry now and again. In chapter 2, Ruth goes out gleaning. She comes back to Naomi with a whole ephah of barley, which sounds like a lot, even though we aren't quite sure how big an ephah was. As they eat, Naomi asks Ruth where she went and what happened, and Ruth gives this summary in chapter 2, 19-23. Her mother-in-law asked her, "Where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." Then Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one at whose place she had been working. "The name of the man I worked with today is Boaz." And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "May he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead. That man is our close relative. He is one of our kinsman redeemers." Then Ruth the Moabite said, He even said to me, 'Stay with my workers until they finish harvesting all my grain.' Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, 'It will be good for you, my daughter, to go with the women who work for him, because in someone else's field you might be harmed.'" Finally, the narration in verse 23 tells us that Ruth stayed close to the women of Boaz to glean until the barley and wheat harvests were finished. I don't know how long the barley and wheat harvest lasted, but I think we can assume some number of weeks pass. Also notice that both Boaz and Naomi expressed concern for Ruth's safety. As an unmarried woman with no husband or brothers, as an immigrant with no established community, she faces the threats that women often face of theft, sexual assault, and worse. It can be a rough world out there, both then and now. It is fortunate that Boaz took notice of her. Let me back up and give you an abbreviation of that dialogue from verses 4 through 12. Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. "The Lord be with you." "The Lord bless you," they answered. Boaz asked the overseer of the harvesters, "Who does that young woman belong to?" The overseer replied, "She is the Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi. She said, 'Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters.' She came into the field and has remained there from morning until now, except for a short rest in the shelter." So Boaz said to Ruth, "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you. And whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled." At this she bowed down with her face to the ground. She asked him, "Why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner?" Boaz replied, "I have been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother in your homeland and came to live with the people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." Word can spread quickly in a small town. Reputation is important, and Ruth is beginning to establish a good one. Our actions can have ripple effects on those around us, and that brings me back to Naomi. In chapter 1, Naomi told the people just to refer to her as Mara, which means bitter. She complained that the Lord had brought all these tragedies on her, including the death of her husband and both of her children. But much to her credit, her grief and anger toward God become part of her faith rather than an excuse to leave it behind. Now in verse 20, she is grateful to God for Boaz. "May he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." Has she been thinking of herself as dead? Perhaps. What was left to her after such a tragedy? I'm sensing a change, a crack in the bitterness where some light is sneaking through. Perhaps she is still among the living after all. Ruth, with whom she had developed such a close bond, certainly is. Perhaps there is some hope for the future. Last week I shared that I am intentionally reading the book of Ruth as an allegory for my congregation, First Presbyterian Troy. Things looked pretty grim in this church about 5 years ago, but something within this congregation shifted. Like Ruth, you worked hard and it was noticed. Like Naomi, you began to hope in the Lord again. As a newcomer, I can certainly see it. You have a confidence and a hope and an energy. And your faith is being noticed in the community. As we finish the story of Ruth and Naomi, you will see that they make the best of a tough situation. They take some gutsy action that leads to a complete change in their lives for the better. When they had arrived in Bethlehem with nothing, now they will soon prosper again. I pray that will continue to be the case for this church as well. Let's see how all this plays out in Ruth chapters 3 and 4. To follow the story, you need to know a little about the legal code of ancient Israel. All inheritance passed through the male line. Women could not own property in their own name. So written into the law was this provision. If a man died without leaving a son, his brother or closest male relative was expected to marry the widow and father children on behalf of the deceased brother, so that the deceased man's name and property could continue. The male relative was known as a kinsman redeemer, or a geol in Hebrew. Similarly, if the family lost land due to debt or misfortune, a kinsman redeemer could purchase it back to keep it within the family. Apparently, Naomi's late husband had no living brothers, but Boaz, who seemed to have taken a liking to Ruth, was the second closest living male relative to Naomi. That's kind of dry stuff. Here's where it gets interesting. Naomi instructs Ruth to get gussied up and go to the barn at night where Boaz is working, winnowing the grain. After a long day of work, Boaz has eaten his dinner and had his wine, and he goes to sleep on a heap of grain. Ruth comes and lays at his feet. And here's what ensues in Ruth 3, 8 through 11. In the middle of the night, something startled Boaz. He turned, and there was a woman lying at his feet. "Who are you?" he asked. "I am your servant Ruth," she said. "Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a kinsman redeemer of our family." "The Lord bless you, my daughter," he replied. "This kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You have not run after the younger men, whether rich or poor. And now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I will do for you all that you ask. All the people of my town know that you are a woman of noble character." At this point, you can read the story in a couple of ways. If you like reading the Bible as literally as possible, verse 14 states that Ruth slept at his feet the whole night. Most commentators assume something else happened there on the threshing floor. It's a little like those movies circa 1950 where a man and woman passionately kiss at night and then the scene fades and they're having breakfast together. Did something else happen in between? Read it the way you like. But for me, what happens on the threshing floor stays on the threshing floor. In any event, Ruth slips out before dawn, and Boaz is really motivated to get the matter settled that day. So Boaz goes to the men of the town and the relative who would have been first in line. He announces that he wants to buy a field that had belonged to Naomi's husband, and he wants to marry Ruth the Moabite. The nearer candidate graciously steps aside, and the men of the town wish blessings on Boaz, and the women of the town are happy for Naomi. The book doesn't detail the wedding, but I assume there must have been one, and it must have been a beautiful occasion. It improves everyone's life. Ruth and Naomi will be provided for. Boaz will not be so lonely. He is probably childless, and, spoiler alert, he and Ruth will have a son. I'm sure it is unrealistic of me to imagine that Orpah came in from Moab to attend the ceremony, but I can't forget about this other young widow. You see, in my allegory of ancient Bethlehem as our church, it all comes together. Naomi, who left and returned, she's back and will thrive. Ruth, also a widow, is an immigrant. She is a new member of our church, and she will thrive. All the people who never left our church also join in and share the blessings. And if Orpah came, well, that would be perfect. She's still living outside the Lord's territory, but we still want to be friends with her. Maybe she will come to faith, maybe not. Her life will be much better if she does, but it isn't a prerequisite for us to talk to her and be in relationship with her, even to do charitable works together with her. If the book of Ruth ended there, that would be fine. If we never heard anything else about Ruth and Boaz, it would still be a good and inspiring story. And in comparison, as I told you last week, this church also has a good and inspiring story. Like Naomi and Ruth, you've come through some tough times into a good present moment. There's a lot to celebrate. But the book of Ruth does not end there. It goes on to speak about a legacy that they leave. You see, Boaz and Ruth do have a son. His name is Obed. Obed has a son. His name is Jesse. And Jesse has a very famous son who becomes king. You know who I'm talking about, the slayer of Goliath, the great war leader, the composer of Psalms, the man after God's own heart, King David. That's right, Boaz and Ruth's great-grandson is David. And great as he was, David has an even more famous and important descendant, Jesus. Yes, that Jesus, our Lord and Savior, the Messiah who centuries later would be born in Bethlehem, the city of David. I can't see the future. I don't know what Troy will look like in a couple of generations, but I have hopes that this church will be part of it. As I said last week, we are going to need to obsess about who we can work with in the good things that we do, people who are outside our congregation currently. We need to find the Ruths and Orpahs out there who have a good heart and invite them to join with us in our activities here. Your session also has some ideas and dreams for some things that we can do to make this building an even more welcoming and better space in which to base our ministry. And they're going to talk about that this morning. And they have some good news to share. Let me close with a word about faith. There are books of the Bible where we are explicitly told that God intervened in people's lives. This book, the book of Ruth, is not one of them. But the characters in this book talk about God all the time. They ascribe all manner of blessings to God. That is a choice. A skeptic could read the book of Ruth and claim that God didn't do anything, and there's nothing explicitly in the text we could use to refute that argument. But Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz and the town all proclaim that God has been active in bringing about the events in their lives. It is the same with the story of this church. You have staged a remarkable comeback. We could look around and give all the credit to a lot of human beings who've worked hard and well, and I am grateful for their hard work and dedication. But you can make a decision to talk about it in terms of faith, and I urge you to make that decision. Give God the glory. I quote Colossians 3. Whatever your task, put yourselves into it as done for the Lord and not for your masters, since you know that from the Lord you will receive the inheritance as your reward. You serve the Lord Christ. So, my friends, look with the eyes of faith, seeing the hand of God in all things. It is a good habit to cultivate. It will serve us well. I can look around and see God's blessings everywhere, and I hope I can get a few amens for that. God bless.